We're out here today doing some scouting. This is kind of a bigger woods area. As I'm sure you can see, there's a lot of timber that's pretty common amongst like northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota type of landscape. And what we'll be doing today as we're doing our scouting is trying to take a lot of notes and make explanations for what we're looking for and why. And hopefully be able to put some pieces together to the puzzle that in this area at least we started to figure out last season quite a bit, and trying to really fill in the gaps and learn more about the landscape this time of year. Ideally, more of the snow is off, but we only got a few inches left, so it's still kind of ideal scouting conditions starting now and for the next like 6-8 weeks. And we're right on the edge of a swamp right behind me here, and on the other side, not too far away, we have a clear cut. And that nice transition line, especially in these bigger woods type areas, almost always will have an area where you have congregation of deer travel along that edge. So right now we're in one of these bigger clear-cut areas, and this one is of the age and tree size where it's getting a fair amount of use. It seems like you have these stages of these clear cuts, right, where they get cut and then you get weeds and early successional growth that kind of takes over, and then at least in this type of area, aspens will start to be the next thing that grows. And once they get of a certain size where deer can start to walk through them, they act as good cover. There's good browse a lot of times of the year. And as we're looking at this one, like actually I think there's a bed right here. We'll mark that one in just a second and show you guys on the camera. But there's rubs here, there's droppings kind of throughout. The thing to remember is we got a slightly rolling habitat in here, and you'll find deer travel in relation to some of these little micro ridges within these clear cuts, and also bedding on certain slopes. And this is where having a little bit of snow can be helpful, because these deer a lot of times will use these in late season too, but they'll also use them a lot of times in early season and during the rut, especially on the edges. So this time of year I really like scouting these areas because you can see through these little saplings and you can see quite a long ways, and even be able to figure out where some of these deer might be bedding during the season. In some areas they move and bed in different spots early versus late, but sometimes they'll bed all year in these types of areas. Now these can be kind of challenging to hunt too. Remember, early season this will be all green. All these saplings will have leaves on them and you can't really see very far. You almost have to hunt on the ground if you're going to hunt them at all. But even kind of mid-season it can be tough. A lot of times a ground setup might make most sense, just because if you do climb one of the few trees that are tall in here, you have no shooting lanes really to get down to the ground. Some of the videos you guys saw last year where we were hunting closer to the edge of these type of clear cuts, we'd be hunting on the ground because it was the best cover and shooting option. But you also have to think about how the deer might use these thermals. Like this deer right here, he's bedding next to this big tree, but when it comes down to evening and the thermals start pooling, they're going to pool in this little depression here. And so it'd be really easy for him to just get out of this bed, slip down this hill, and then he's going to feel really safe collecting all of that scent from around him before he makes a direction on where to move from there. We just walked over to this spot right here. You can see it's this little deadfall. There's a little oak tree, and there's a trail heading toward it. It looked like there might be a deer bedded up there. We found this bare spot on the ground, and we're thinking, okay, is this a bed or is this not a bed? And there's droppings and old rubs around it, and kind of the qualifier for us is, are there any hares on that spot? It's not necessarily a guarantee if you find like one or two, but it's nice to find some hares in there. It's kind of a little confirmation that it likely is a spot where a deer's bedding, instead of just a bare spot on a slightly southern slope that got more sun. And as we look around, again, this particular bed is on a little spine of high ground within this overall bigger clear cut. So I really like finding scrapes, good scrapes in these type of habitats. And one of the things that separates good scrapes from bad scrapes a lot of times is just location and context of what's around the scrape, and also is there a good licking branch. If you just find a scrape with no licking branch, it doesn't really mean as much to me. And this is kind of a tip that it's taken me a while to get better and better over the years of doing this, but it works in the summer and it works this time of year too. The scrapes are going to be most visible when there's no snow on the ground and there's no greenage that's come up. So this time of year, when we got snow on the ground, it's tough to sometimes tell if there's a scrape there or not. So we found this spot where we had these overhanging branches, and it seems like, just contextually, there should be a scrape in this area. And we see these branches and it's like, well, we can't obviously tell that there's a scrape on the ground, but we can investigate these licking branches, and sure enough, you can tell that they're being used. And in fact, there's even some deer hair stuck in one of them. So we know for sure that we can mark this as a scrape area and key in on it potentially next fall. And the context that made us think to even look for a scrape here in the first place is, number one, there's a lot of bedding around this area, but we're on an edge where we have this little depression where there's even like a little pond back there with some water collecting, and on this little ridge next to it, there's thick all around, but then you have this little opening amongst the thick, and in that opening, you have that licking branch hanging down. Very good recipe for finding a scrape. So Sam actually picked this out while I was doing that last video segment, and that's that in this area too, we got a bunch of these little twigs, and just about every single one of them on this little hillside here is nipped off at the top. So you can tell that the deer have been feeding on these little, saplings coming out of the ground and using that as a food source. There's another licking branch right here, scrape. We got rubs down there. We got rubs down here closer to that water source. So this is probably one of those areas that I would not be surprised if this gets used early in the year as well. Deer could be bedding in the clear cuts, moving into this area, and I could see this also being a good area during that pre-rut and rut time frame when the deer might use this edge as somewhat of a travel corridor too, and use this to kind of smell a whole lot of the deer potential bedding around it, because it is in an area where there's a whole lot of ups and downs. So if a deer follows a path through here, they're going to get a lot of upward thermals throughout the day, bottom thermals coming down in the evenings and in the early mornings, and they don't have to travel very far to smell a lot of potential beds. So now the last thing for us here in this spot would be to figure out how do we set up on this type of a spot. There's two trees right down here that I really like by the water edge. I like them by the water edge because, again, in the evening we would probably be coming in from the opposite direction and allowing those thermals in that last light period to kind of just sink down, and they're going to sink down toward that water source. And that's when we'll be able to set up on some of these trees here on the edge with good cover, and if these deer come out of this clear cut area, then we'll have a pretty good shot at them. So here's an example of another bed that we found, and this one is in like more pure swamp where we got all this timbered area around us, but if you come into this area in the summer or even in the fall before it really freezes up, this is a really kind of like spongy, wet area where you're punching through with your boots and it's real mucky. But this time of year it's all frozen, and it's really common to find beds, especially like in this type of scenario where you have this good evergreen creating back cover, a little bit of thermal cover, shelter for that northern wind coming across the top, and we got that southern direction just totally exposed to where there's not really anything blocking that sun throughout its entire path. And so this deer is able to just sit here and basically be sitting in the sun, shelter from the wind all day. So this is most likely late season bed, but there's a chance it could be used throughout the rest of the year too, so we'll mark it regardless and keep on walking. But if you find yourself around these timbered swamps, that's a pretty common thing that you'll find, especially near the edges of them. These types of beds also, it can be a little bit tougher, at least for me, to tell if it's buck bedding or doe bedding. Usually it seems like the buck bedding, there's some kind of context around it, like maybe the high ground tapers out to a little point in the swamp or something like that, or there's really obvious like rubs right in the bed. So one of the things to look for this time of year that can really pay dividends come fall is if you're primarily a rut hunter, that's when you have most of your PTO, you can really get a lot of value out of finding those really good pinch points just by walking the land and figuring out where they are. And so in this particular spot that we are standing in right now, it's a really good example of that, where we have this higher ground area where there's a couple fallen trees and it's just a little thicker in general. We know a lot of does will bed up here. You can walk up there, there's lots of trails going back and forth off of this bedding area, and it's pretty easy to verify that there's deer bedding in there. On the other side, we have a really wet marsh. Some of it has some trees in it, but it's a lot of open marsh, just really wet. If you walk it in the summer, you're sinking up past your knee every step. And then between those two areas, we have this area of really flat ground that's somewhat wet in the summer, but it's also somewhat dry, kind of spongy, but it has more of that timbered swamp feel to it. And you can see behind me here, and in the background, that's probably all you can really see. Well, that area is pretty vast, but right in the spot that we're at, it pinches down pretty tight between these two habitat types. So we have 3 habitat types all converging right here. And in the areas where you have those transition lines, they're pinching down to probably about a 15-yard window right here. And we have a nice rub over here. You can verify that bucks are probably cruising this during the rut downwind of that doe bedding area. And so all that's left at this point is to look at your most common wind directions for November and then pick the right tree to be able to set up in. So we picked one of these trees right here, and then if we got the right wind direction come November, it's gonna be a really great spot to sit. As I started recording that clip, I heard a deer bust out of its bed, so I'll go check that out next. But what I was going to say is that as much as possible, I like to try and front load my scouting on areas that have a lot of ice like this, where, yeah, I can maybe scout them in the summer, but it's a nightmare. And I can walk on this ice and get the same intel, but it's so much easier to get. And usually that time period between when the snow really melts and this ice starts to become unwalkable is very short, very narrow window. So now is definitely the time to do it for me, and then I got all the rest of the spring to scout the dry ground stuff. Right here is an example of another really good rut spot, and this one is maybe a little bit more challenging to just figure out on the fly. But what I've observed in this spot is that we have a big swamp out here, and then we have more high ground over here. The deer will a lot of times feed up in the high ground because there's some areas of clear cuts, there's a lot of browse up there. There's also browse down here, and I think they do eat it. You see signs of it every now and then, but I feel like the quality of the browse is usually a little bit better on that high ground. Plus you have, if you go certain ways, acorns at certain times of year. But what you find is that a lot of the sign is going in and out. A lot of trails. I mean, if you walk along this transition line, you find a lot of overall deer sign and some fairly heavy trails, and they're all kind of zigzagging going through, but mostly in and out of the swamp. And one of the things I observed last fall, and it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, but might not be super intuitive to everybody, is that a lot of that traffic going in and out is does that are bedding and they're going to feed, bed to feed. Whereas once those bucks start cruising late October, scent checking for does, and then even into early November, is that those bucks might just draw a line right along this transition. And so I can find some of these fainter trails that are right along the edge, and in this particular instance, one of them kind of, it angles out, but it's still the trail that the bucks are using. It angles out just shy of where a lot of those does are bedding, and then comes right along this transition line. And last fall I observed one of those really older bucks in this area doing that exact thing. He was slipping through ultra quiet with the wind coming out of the swamp, and if I hadn't looked just at the right time, I wouldn't have even seen him moving through there. So you can tell it's pretty thick, and this parallel trail doesn't really have great shooting options. So I just spent the last half hour trying to figure out which tree I could potentially be in. And yeah, I want to be able to shoot to that trail that that buck was using, but also I want to be able to see if there's some type of spot that I can maximize shooting onto the high ground and also into the swamp too, which isn't easy. The reason I'd want to do that is that buck might use that trail, or he might use one of those other trails, especially if he's on a doe, and then he's just going to do whatever the doe does. So shootability is still important for a spot like this, and I think what I've settled on is this tree back behind me here that's right next to that evergreen. It angles out to the swamp just a little bit, and when I climb up into that tree, I have great back cover, and I also have the ability to move, for me as a lefty, over my bridge, turn on that platform, and I can be able to shoot out onto that swamp trail with very minimal movement, or on all of my strong side, I could be able to shoot up to this high ground and some of these other trails. I wouldn't want to be doing all of this intrusion during the season, because I mean, literally the last half hour, I've been walking 360s around this tree every which way, trying to figure out what's the best way to set up in here, putting scent all over the place. So now is definitely the time of year to get that done. And now I know when I come back in here in November, if I have that wind coming out of the swamp and I want to be able to sit that spot, I know exactly where I'm going. I can just go straight line right to the tree, pop up, and I'm ready to hunt. One of the ways you can find that parallel trail too is that a lot of times there's either going to be fresh rubs or historical rubs from that time of year. So when I'm on that trail that kind of angles out here, I can see historical rubs some from last year, but also some older ones. And that gives me the clue that, okay, a lot of these trails overall, they have a lot of deer sign, they're heavily used, but they don't have rubs on them. But that one trail has rubs. And if you walk on any one of these in and out trails, you might still find those rubs there, and you think that they're on those trails, but I think a lot of times it's the deer using those trails, and then once he hits that crossing of those doe trails, that's where a lot of times those rubs will get left. But anyways, that concept of a buck cruising perpendicular to a lot of those doe trails next to bedding during the rut, there's nothing new. That concept has been around a long time, and it works. And this hopefully just gives you a real world example of where, in this specific instance, how that would play out. But you can apply that same concept to a lot of different areas.